Well, welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today, my guest is Mikael, and we're going to discuss front-end architectures and kind of maybe some different architectures with React and maybe some things that are changing here. But before we get to that, Mikael, could you maybe give me a bit of your story when it comes to your tech career and then also kind of how you got into React and front-end architectures?
Yeah, sure. First of all, happy to be here. This is exciting. I always like to talk about technology in general. And over the years, it turns out I've now beginning to realize I have a lot of experience in particularly the front-end development world. I was trying to think about it when you were asking me, when you sent all the questions and tell me a bit about your story, and I'm thinking, my story, okay. So it turns out I now have been coding professionally at least part-time since I was 17 years old. So that's almost 20 years. And most of that has been in the front-end world. So a lot of has changed since the mid-2000s in regards to how we think about doing front-end development. And that's always, I always turn back to front-end development because it's changing and it's so like user interaction based, and you can do a lot of visually things. And but it's always also been important for me to kind of have a broad experience. So I've done a lot of .NET database stuff, cloud stuff, OCaml, F# and much more, and trying to always like pick up different advantages of those platforms and those languages and applying it for front-end development, because I always turn back to front-end. Also, for me, community is always important. So I'm doing a lot of, in Norwegian at least, sort of like podcasts. I started JavaScript communities, do a lot of open source, things like, probably the most notable things like Node Notifier is a package I've been doing now for 10 years, I guess. And then that's had a lot of adoption on different side of things like Jest, and Facebook uses that for things. And also I went back and see that bit.li is still using a front-end framework I made in 2014, which was called Omniscient, which is, for me at least, pretty cool. That's probably for them, it's a nightmare to maintain a 10-year-old framework. But that was kind of part of trying to shift React over to the functional paradigm things. So we were packaging in, at that time it was only class-based. So we're taking things like from Clojure scripts from David Nolan and immutable JS from Lee Byron, and taking the immutable approach from the unidirectional flow side of things. So this wasn't as common as it is today. There were still someone doing it, but part of the exploration phase of trying to move React over to what we now know as the more component-based architecture stuff. So that's been like very formative for my experience, at least the around 2014, I guess. And I think most of my interests in front-end architecture stems from that time, as well as in trying to think about how we're doing it and solving different applications over my years as a consultant at different teams, at different products, trying to see what is applicable here from different types of architectures and thinking about how we're making those applications.
Awesome. That's really cool. Definitely been in kind of the front end and the development space a lot longer than I have. I am coming up around like 5 or 6 years at this point. So when I kind of first started learning React, it was kind of in that transitionary period between going from class components to kind of the functional kind of architecture. And I know that like for me starting out, it's like I first learned class components, and then it was like 2 months after I felt like I had a good handle on that. It was like, all right, here's hooks and functional components. I was like, all right, whatever. So that was definitely a challenge there. But kind of one thing we've been mentioning, and just to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page here, is front-end architecture. And I think that's definitely kind of maybe a loose term. Like a lot of people might refer to something as front-end architecture to where some others might refer to something else. So when we're talking about front-end architecture, how would you kind of define that?
So that's a very good question, because it's kind of put together by two nonsensical words. So both front-end and architecture is such broad terms they can mean literally anything. So, but let's just take the front-end part first, because even that, a lot of people tend to think about front-end like the code that's running in your browser. But that's just a part of the front-end, I guess, at least from how I categorize it in my day-to-day life. So doing front-end is a lot more about what type of applications you're creating or what type of tasks you're doing that's user-centric, for instance. So that might entail a browser component. That might entail also a server or even caching like Redis or a backend for front-end if you're doing apps and web servers and API layers. But everything that's centered around solving an entire stack of a task for end user is the front-end world in my mind. So it's not only the JavaScript that's running in your browser. That's too narrow and won't allow you to think about it holistically in a sense. And architecture is kind of the same, because anything can be architecture. And it's definitely something that's, you're doing architecture every day when trying to design APIs, for instance. That's some sort of architecture. And choosing, for instance, a specific library can also be thought of as an architecture. But in these like broader sense and broader terms, I think architecture is all about the different components of said front end, like servers and even state management or whatever, and everything coming together and how it is put in relation to each other. So how they interact on a more abstract term. So again, it's very like, even that is abstract in itself, but think of things like software architectural patterns, like model view controller. That's one type of specific architecture that's used on a more application level side of things. So the idea that you're grouping anything like a model that's containing the data, and you have a view layer, and you have the controller that's taking the data and presenting in a view layer. So that's one specific type of architecture. And when talking about before the React times, for instance, that was also maybe the main architecture that was trying to be applied over to the front-end side as well, because things like .NET and whatever used MVC and MVVM and MV star type of patterns, and the most like natural way of moving code over to the client side was by just applying the same architectural pattern over there. But then again, things like we had Angular in Knockout, which was before, like after the jQuery time, but before the React time, they were trying to do MVVM over in the browser. But then we see that that maybe didn't fit with the mental model of the HTML and the DOM as well. So transitioning over to things we now know as like the component architecture, which is the more modern sense of doing it. So it's when I speak about like front-end architecture, it's at that type of level of abstract, and when I'm saying like component and their relations to each other, it's not UI component stuff, but how the components of your software. But terms in computer science and in software is always hard, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also like hard to sometimes describe in words, like different components of your front-end architecture. Like when you're building an app, I think like you have a good sense of the different components you're working with. But when it comes to actually like explaining the abstract concept of front-end architecture, that could be pretty tough, but I think you did a really good job with it. And I would say that when I think of front-end architectures, one kind of piece of that is whether my site is just like a single page application or whether it is more of like a static server rendered site. And we have like different hybrids between those two of, kind of you do some stuff on the client and do some stuff server side and then kind of do some hydration in the middle. So with that, what do you kind of think about the current state of single page applications versus more static sites? And what do you kind of see as maybe some pros and cons of developing a site that is mostly a single page application versus a site that is maybe more of a static site to where it's maybe rendered on the server and then kind of sent to the client?
Static sites and single page applications and mix there between is definitely like different types of solutions to try to solve a specific type of problem. So in that sense, it's architecture as well. But it's also, I think, what is being difficult, I guess, is that over the years, when clients are getting richer, so more functionality, more demands to different types of solutions, and the way to handle those increase of demands has been to increase the code over to the client side. So transitioning from doing like in before 2010s, for instance, the most common way to do it was just to do things like .NET framework and MVC .NET framework or Ruby on Rails or PHP with whatever Laravel, or trying to do more interactive applications. We're moving more and more code over to the client side. At some point, we're ending up with the entire code base running in your on your browser. And this is kind of like single page applications, starting with an empty page and doing the entire application, building that brick by brick and running it in the entire context of your user. And what we're getting is increased dynamicisms, whatever, more dynamic pages. But also there are a lot of trade-offs, because at some point you're transitioning away from doing web applications or web sites and doing applications that's distributed through the web as a protocol. And that, I think that's an important distinction, because at some point you're trying to treat everything like an application that's being distributed. So we're moving everything that's not actually an application over to doing the most dynamic way of doing it, which is a single page application. And the problem with that is that single applications there are a lot of drawbacks. So advantages is very dynamic, it's very rich, you can do a lot of things, and most devices for a lot of people are very powerful and can do a lot of things. So it's the demos and the state of art things for doing things in single page applications with rich applications is very impressive. But also you end up having to do a lot of like manual compensation for everything for doing that. So we're doing, instead of using the browser as a router and the URL as a state and the browser as a state machine, and instead of using things like accessibility by default by built-in mechanisms in the browser, we're having to compensate and doing a lot more code for that. So in transitioning over to single-page applications, we're losing a lot of like automatic crawling abilities, like for search engines to crawl it, but also accessibility tooling. We're losing things like navigation by default with keyboards, where form states management, so a lot of history management, routing and navigation and whatever. We're losing a lot of that those aspects, and also we're having to do things like security in an entirely different way. So doing implicit flows in OAuth for the longest times. But that's not a safe way to do it. So we have to invent new mechanisms for compensating all the transitions over there. So it's definitely have a lot of advantages, but it also have a lot of drawbacks. So this means that it's not the silver bullet solution for every type of applications there are. I guess somewhere around, 2015 or 2016, a lot of people also realized that, hey, not every page we're making has to be dynamic. So we went the entirely different direction with static pages, which is essentially just generated HTML and outputted to the server. It can be cached forever. It doesn't require any running on for the devices. You can run it on any device you want, essentially. Again, it has a lot of advantages, but not every application is either entirely static or entirely dynamic. So there is a landscape in between that's kind of being filled with different explorations for the last 4 or 5 years. So yeah, things like incremental regeneration or static regeneration from the Vercel in the next camp, which is trying to do a mix between static pages, but is asynchronously loaded built static pages. These static pages and single page applications are kind of edges on the spectrum for me, like mental model wise. So between there is a lot of different ways to handle things depending on what type of need your application has. So for instance, sometimes you have to do an entirely dynamic page. Sometimes you have to do an entirely static page, but more often than not, it's somewhere in between. But trying to follow the best practices of things is very hard because we often forget when trying to mimic others or in cargo culting others, we're forgetting that we have a different context and we have a different problems to solve than the guide on on a blog post is saying that single page application and client-side rendering is the way to go. But in our sense, we have something entirely different that we're creating. So it doesn't make to just mimic that side. And for me, now the transition to explore instead of thinking it from a client side perspective, from a browser side perspective, which is both the static page and the single page approach, is both oriented around what we think about from the browser side of things. But we're now seeing a transition that's instead from the client perspective or from the browser perspective over to the server perspective. And that's kind of back to the way before the single page application era from 2010s and onwards. And that's kind of the overall changing nature, I guess, from the front-end architecture way.
And I would say that that's a very good summary of kind of the pros and cons of more of a statically generated site versus kind of a client-rendered one. And like you said, whether it's not that one is just unequivocally better than the other in all circumstances. Depending on context, you might want a site that is a bit more kind of client rendered versus server rendered or vice versa. And in one of your talks, you kind of mentioned that we're kind of changing into seeing a bit more of thinking about things in more of a server first way, to whereas in certain meta frameworks like Next.js, we're seeing the kind of new server components in which things are defaulting to be a server component, and you have to explicitly say, I want this to be a client component by putting use client at the top of the file. So how do you see things kind of changing here? We've already hit on it a bit. And what do you think are maybe some of the implications of kind of thinking in this server first manner here?
For the longest time, we're in the web community, it's very taken pride in, and there's been a general consensus in the front-end world that flexibility trumps everything. So being able to pick and choose any implementation you have and you want for state management, module management, routers, or DOM integrations like virtual DOMs and whatever, being able to choose those different things has been like the main priority. But I guess that at some point, like you mentioned, Next.js, I don't think that could have been as popular as it is now for just 5 years ago, because the world wasn't ready for that type of opinionated, all-encompassing solution. But suddenly the entire ecosystem and the community is. So we're seeing a lot of things like meta frameworks, or rather frameworks, but things like Next.js and Remix and SvelteKit and Quick City and whatever. There are a lot of them that all kind of solve the same problem space. But also what they do, which got me thinking, is that when you get more opinionated ways of handling this, you can also be nudged or enforced in a specific direction. So, and one of those direction is like the server first thought pattern that I think is the most like important thing that's happening for now. So I was talking about .NET and PHP and Ruby and how those were used to create applications. And there is a reason why kind of the way you think about creating an application in those solutions is entirely different than thinking about the client-side rendered stuff, for instance, because you're running in an entirely different context. When you're running something in a browser, you know, this is the user that's running this code is the only one that has access to this code. That has a lot of advantages, but also some drawbacks. For instance, how do you handle secrets? How do you handle authentication, authorization? How do you handle critical code or hidden details in your applications? How do you handle scaling and whatever? So thinking about that and switching up to what is the source of truth and what is the initial kind of like the initial initiator of the information flow, which is kind of abstract, but so for a single page application or even server-side rendering, which is kind of single page application just with provided HTML in addition, but there everything you're doing like creating it creates a state on the client side and requests information from the server side. For instance, hey, I need this information. But when you get the information, the state and the state machine that you're creating implicitly is stored at the client side level, at this in the browser. So that's always kind of the source of truth. But switching it over to the server first thought pattern, you have to move a lot of that information or a lot of that over in an entirely different way. So instead of having the client ask for some information and storing the state, you're providing the client with some information and you have the initial state. So that means that you're suddenly running information and running code execution on a part that's shared with others. There are other users using this type of context. The application code I'm writing right now, for instance, could be used by others as well. But it also means I can have secrets where I'm running this. It can be, I can share state implicitly between different clients. I can auto-scale different things, and I can provide, instead of running in a single-threaded environment for the browser, kind of, you have some sense of doing multi-threaded natures in browser, but realistically not. But suddenly in a server environment, you can have some sort of that. So it switches entirely how the defaults you have to think about when creating an application. So, and that's entirely different than, for instance, server-side rendering, because server-side rendering is oriented around the browser. And this transition is something I think couldn't have happened, at least not as rapidly, if we're not having things like Next.js and big actors like Vercel that's championing this type of thought pattern over to the server side. So this is, I see this architecture type also referring to as streamable component architecture, which is different than component architecture that's kind of like common from React world. And essentially almost every framework there is using the same component architecture, but I also see most of them are also transitioning and exploring the space of streamable component architecture, which again entails all the like difference in thinking about how to create applications from the server-side perspective.
In particular, I think Quick uses the idea of like resumability to kind of do a similar thing there. So yeah, I think that with all this transitions, and I think that you make a really good point on how for the longest time, people, what they loved about React was that it was super flexible and they didn't make any decisions and it just kind of provided you some stuff, but you couldn't make these decisions about your architecture. But you are seeing the shift towards people are actually finding that like, hey, having some structure in place from one of these other frameworks like Next or QuickCity or whatever it might be actually provides some kind of benefits there. And I think that the kind of pendulum has kind of swung back into that favor there. And, hopefully we'll find the middle ground of, hey, not doing all client side. Maybe everything on the client isn't the best idea, but also doing everything on the server, maybe also not the best idea, but having some sort of kind of mix in between depending on what problem you're actually solving and actually thinking about, okay, does this actually need to be client rendered, or what are the benefits of doing it versus server rendered, and making that decision based on the problem you're solving rather than just, making everything a client-side rendered application because all you know is React, actually kind of thinking about these different things.
Yeah, and speaking of like previously terms in software development, so everything that's now kind of modern to talk about, which is partial hydration from the Next world and the Astro worlds and the resumability from the Quick, is actually just different names, I guess, for the relationship between the server and the browser. But again, it's the same solution and it's the same application. It just is names of different techniques. So for me, I like to think about, for instance, partial hydration, which again is different than the server-side rendering traditionally, which is often called hydration just, because on server-side rendering, it's just like a single-page application, but you have HTML, like I said, and then you're creating and constructing based on the initial state, the entire application in the browser side. But partial hydration moves it further back and saying that this is my static or my generated page outputted from the server, but this particular part, this specific component should be dynamic on the server, on the client side. And resumability is exactly the same thing, but instead of having like eager dynamic components from partial hydration, it's a lazy initial parts of the site is dynamic. So this part of my site is still dynamic, but is only just dynamic when it's interacted with. So it's so that allows you, for instance, to like spit out from the server an entirely static page, but it's actually dynamic when you're interacting with it. So in that sense, only the part that's needed for you as a client or you as a user is loaded in from the server. So we're reducing some of the overhead on that. But all these terms are just like variations and small nuances from a specific like relationship between the server. And I get it. It gets hard to distinguish between those different, but it's more or less the same.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of these kind of variations of kind of getting at the same problem, regardless of whatever variation you choose, usually it's still going to work out pretty well for kind of your use case if it is just like a slight variation there. So kind of with that, Mikael, is there anything else that you want to leave the listeners with? Any kind of final takeaways or any kind of final advice for someone like, man, we have all these different variations of resumability and this and that and this. Is there anything that you recommend them like learning or kind of moving towards or anything like that?
I guess you said it very eloquently just now, but no matter what you're choosing, it works out in some sense. Mm-hmm. There are some drawbacks, but nothing is lost. So instead, thinking of try to broaden your horizons, try to test out different things, get experience. I think of getting experience and learning is a lot like improv comedy. It's a lot of yes and. So if someone asks you if you want to do this or if this is required from you, you just say yes and you're trying to require and building off of each other to learn from different things. So don't get limited by specific implementations and specific terms. Just explore and try different things. But it's also good to keep in mind when doing it professionally, do something that's safe and start with lower types of abstractions and moving over to higher types of abstractions over time. So for instance, don't start with a full-fledged single-page applications when you don't know the requirements of your dynamic, the level of how much dynamic you need to be. So start with minimal solutions and build incrementally and explore and test out, and you'll get experience over time, I guess.
Perfect. Well, with that, Mikael, if people want to kind of follow along with what you're doing online, is there anywhere that they can go to stay up to date with anything that you're doing?
Less and less, but I'm still on Twitter or X. Yeah. It hurts to say it, but so that's at Mikael Brevik, which is Mikael Brevik, I guess. It's hard. You can Google my name and probably find it.
I'll have it linked in the description, so that'll be good. And well, thank you so much for coming on today. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure the listeners did as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.